Welcome to the Lead with Levity podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Walker, and this episode is for you if you are stressed out. Yes, if you are stressed out, and if you are working with people who are stressed out, this episode is for you. So technically, it is for you, for 100% of you who are tuning in right now. I'm talking to our next guest, Kelly Campbell. And Kelly is a trauma-informed leadership coach and the author of Heal to Lead, Revolutionizing Leader Through Trauma Healing. And honestly, we're going to have some good conversation today about how trauma can get stored in your body, how it can affect you when you're working, when you're interacting with others, how it can affect you years later, way after the actual event happened, and how it can show up in a lot of different ways in our lives, unexpected ways. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll get into what that looks like in the workplace. And we'll unpack a scenario about a leader named David who basically cuts people off and is just like, I've heard enough, we're moving on, already made the decision, let's go, this is what we're going to do. Doesn't really take the time to listen to his people. So we'll unpack, what does a trauma-informed approach look like for a situation like that, as well as some other scenarios at work. So I think that there's plenty here for you in this next conversation, especially if you're thinking about what can you do for yourself to be the best version of yourself at work for others. And then also, how can you bring a little bit of empathy, a little bit of awareness and sensitivity to coworkers who maybe are approaching things in a way that makes it hard to get work done with them. I'm looking forward to this episode. I'm looking forward to sharing it with all of you. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed this episode.
It's time for a sneak peek. Sneak peek, sneak peek.
I think that there's a myth that a lot of people who are like, I don't want to know anything about trauma in my workplace or being a trauma-informed leader. That probably means that I'm going to have to act like a therapist with my employees, and that feels like boundary issues and all these things. That's a myth. That's not what this means. It really means that you're able to and have practice in holding space for what might be happening for someone inside of their body, inside of your work environment.
And now, on with the show.
When you're feeling the pressure, take a moment to step back, pick up your marbles, and choose to lead with levity. Join us on the Lead with Levity podcast for fireside chats that will fill your bucket and help you get back to being the leader you were meant to be. Now here's your host, Dr. Heather Walker.
Welcome back to the Lead with Levity podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Walker, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next guest, Kelly Campbell. Kelly is a social impact leader, trauma-informed leadership coach, as well as the author of Heal to Lead, Revolutionizing Leadership Through Trauma Healing. It's a book about how you can transform trauma to uncover innate leadership powers to restore the world. Kelly, I'm so excited that you're here today. I think there's a lot of opportunity for healing at work. A lot of opportunity for healing at work. So let me ask you, well, first of all, welcome. Welcome, Kelly. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much, Heather. I am really excited to be here and just to have this conversation. More and more people are having conversations about the workplace as like a healing environment, and I am super here for it.
Yes, yes. I've worked in nonprofit spaces, mental health organizations, and so I'm familiar with the concept of healing communities and healing individuals, especially when we're talking about therapy and social work and all of that stuff. But I would love to learn more about what healing can look like at work. So when you think about that, when you're going into a workplace and you're talking about healing and bringing a trauma-informed perspective, I think there's a lot for us to unpack. So first of all, trauma-informed, that word that phrase is not something that's common. So, can you help us understand what do we mean by trauma informed and trauma informed leadership? What does all of that look like?
Yeah. So let's start with trauma
Yes.
because there are a million definitions. If you go and Google it, you're going to find lots and lots of different ways to describe and understand trauma from the Greek meaning wound. Really, this is about experiences that have overwhelmed us to the point where our nervous systems couldn't cope with it. So it's not the event itself that has happened to us, or events plural, or even ongoing events. It's our nervous system's inability to cope with those experiences that get stored in the body.
Mm.
The way that I talk about trauma in terms of like a different definition or just a different way to think about it is it's not, I didn't come up with this definition. It's just the best that I've encountered so far. Unintegrated information,
Hmm.
right? So this is information that is given to us or that we now have that is unprocessed or unresolved or unintegrated in our bodies. And until we integrate it, it remains. And it essentially, and this goes into the workplace conversation, it essentially programs and imprints us into our way of being, the way that we show up, the way that we think, our thought patterns, the way that we lead, the way that we communicate with other people, how we get activated or not in different scenarios.
Mm.
So it literally lays the foundation for everything about who we are and, how we show up.
I think it's really important to help people understand how trauma can get stored in a body. What are we talking about when we say that? Because on the surface, if it's the first time that you've heard something like that, it could sound like woo-woo. And I remember I went to a session once. It was a session for healing workers, and the session was all about compassion fatigue, where because you work to help others, it can become overwhelming to the point of burnout. And they said something that stuck with me for years. They said, your issues are in your tissues. Have you heard that before, Kelly?
Yeah.
Your
Yep.
issues are in your tissues. And I was like, what are you talking about? Every time you have an event that hurts, you brace, right? You brace, you hold tension in certain areas, your stomach, your neck, different parts of your body. And you're training yourself, right, to respond in that way every single time. So can you help us understand, how do you think about it when you're thinking about how trauma gets stored in the body itself?
Yeah, so obviously the work of Bessel van der Kolk comes to mind. The Body Keeps the Score, the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. All of this is the idea that when something happens, there's an experience that we encounter,
Yeah.
again, where our nervous system doesn't have the capacity or the bandwidth or the ability to really shake it off, right? And keep going, then all of that trauma, all of that information is stored in the nervous system, not really in the memory bank, but like the nervous system, the tissues, the fascia, all of these literal parts of our bodies, right? And so when something similar to that experience, even slightly resonant to that experience of trauma, happens to us later in life, we react as if that same experience is happening, maybe if we're talking about childhood trauma, something that we were when we were younger. So it's a storing of this information and experience in the body that is then being activated again when something similar is happening to us. So this might, in a workplace situation, this might look like someone gets some negative feedback, and all of a sudden that person either crumbles, right? They have a really emotional reaction. They're not just tearing up, but really having like sobbing. That's not about the feedback.
Right.
That's about when they were yelled at by their caregiver and felt deep shame when they were 6 or something that they did, right?
Yeah.
So the correlation here with environments, especially workplace environments, becoming containers for healing, hopefully, if we have leaders who are doing their healing work and understand this, who are trauma informed, they can become environments where that work is, and that environment is safe enough to do that work in, right? Because we can then have these experiences over and over again that give us different evidence. And if we are ourselves doing the healing work, we can start to release that trauma from the body. And that's mostly through somatic work, which is movement of the body, releasing that from those tissues that you were talking about earlier.
So, what does it mean to be a trauma informed leader? Is it sensitivity? Is there something else? What do they need to do that maybe they're not already doing?
Yeah, so I would say there's, some different levels. There are trauma aware
Mm-hmm.
leaders or people, there are trauma informed practitioners, and then there are trauma responsible folks, right? So where I sit is right in the middle there, which is trauma informed. What that means is that I've gone through training to understand what trauma is, how it shows up, how it gets stored in the body, what all of the different definitions are, small t trauma, big T trauma. A lot of it is subjective in a way, but then we rely on studies like the ACEs
Yes.
from Kaiser Permanente and the CDC from the mid 1990s, which, by the way, I think needs to be redone, but that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I have feelings. I have lots of feelings about the ACEs study.
I do too.
I want hope, and I feel like the ACEs study doesn't give us hope. It just gives us like, this is your death sentence, basically. You went through all of these things as a child, and now you are more likely to have all of these health issues and all kinds of issues. And now what do I do? Is it just
Well,
therapy? Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What's fascinating to me about the ACEs study is, first of all, it is really only looking at whatever it is, 8 to 12 of the quote unquote big T traumas, right? There's so much room for other
That's
things
right.
that should be on that list. That's my number one issue. Number two is it was a very, very homogenous group of people who were surveyed. These were predominantly white, heterosexual, college educated males who all had health insurance. That's who was interviewed for that study. So you're talking about a very thin slice of the entire spectrum of humanity through a very specific lens, and you're only talking about two handfuls worth of experiences. None of them, by the way, are what we would now call like small t, humiliation, betrayal,
Right.
abandonment,
Those are
rejection.
huge.
All of those are huge, right? But we call them small.
Well, back in the
So,
90s, maybe. What's
right,
small?
when no one talked about trauma. Here's
No.
the other issue that I have with it, Heather, is that I believe the number is like 62 or 63% of those people who reported that they had these traumatic experiences. That was back in the 90s when no one talked about it, right? Could you imagine today if we had the breadth of the people who we were surveying, all of the things that we would understand as trauma, that number would be 100%, and I would guarantee that.
Oh, yeah.
So I have,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
lots and lots. I share your sentiment. I have lots of feelings about the ACEs study.
This is true. I know we're kind of digressing a little bit with this, but one thing that came out of ACEs is the conversation about the need for support for people, the need to pay attention to what's happening to children and how that can affect someone across their entire lifespan. This is huge. We're having conversations. I just had a conversation with my mother who's about to turn 70, and she's saying, wow, we should have more conversations about mental health, and I didn't know about all these things, and people aren't talking about this. And I have a PhD in psychology, so I thought maybe my mother would know. So it's something that I would say the general population, they're not necessarily having these conversations all the time, but I'm very happy that at least it started the conversation. And we know that we need to build and we need to continue to do research and continue to see what can help people. But I'm just glad that we are talking about it now.
Yeah, I agree. And also, being a trauma-informed practitioner or coach or leader, that wouldn't even be a thing that we would be talking about right now as a
Mm.
title or as a profession. or as a way of being, right? Because it
Right.
really is a practice. I'm not just a trauma-informed leadership coach. I'm a trauma-informed human. I
Mm,
bring that training and that understanding and that compassion and that awareness into every relationship I have, whether that's with my own parent or my partner or my friends or a client.
yeah. Yeah.
So, but you did ask about trauma-informed before. So I think I was kind of going in that direction.
I did. And I got us off track. I apologize.
No, it's great. I don't apologize. I love it. I love organic conversation. So I think that there's a myth that a lot of people who are like, I don't want to know anything about trauma in my workplace or being a trauma-informed leader. That probably means that I'm going to have to act like a therapist with my employees, and that feels like boundary issues and all these things. That's a myth. That's not
Hmm.
what this means. It really means that you're able to and have practice in holding space for what might be happening for someone inside of their body, inside of your work environment.
Hmm.
That's all it means,
Yeah.
right? Yes, it's being empathetic, but even more so, it's being compassionate, right? The difference between the two being the action orientation. If I'm empathetic, I'm feeling with you. If I'm compassionate, I'm feeling with you and I'm taking an action to support you. That really is what a conscious leader is, right? Really leaning into and understanding that the more that we support our people, the health and well-being of our people, the more successful, however you define success, the more successful our organizations will be. As a lagging indicator, that might be greater revenue, higher profit margin, et cetera. That will come naturally as a flow of this.
Mm.
So that's how I think about it,
Yeah.
in its totality.
So Kelly, when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about this as we've got in the business world, I think a term that people can connect with and they're learning about more and more is psychological safety, right? Creating psychological safety for your people so that they can feel free to have conversations about things that are on their mind. They can feel free to learn and test and know that they are not going to be harmed in that process. And I don't know how you feel about this, but trauma informed leadership to me, holding space is an element of that. So, especially when you're thinking about every single person on your team is coming in with different experiences, different things that are going on in their lives at that point in time. Depending on what they want to do in the future, they may have concerns and fears and all of that. And so, being able to hold space for them and all of those experiences that they have and what might be going on within them, fears and apprehension and anxiety, that's to me a part of creating a psychologically safe space.
Yeah. So the only thing that I want to build on with that is I don't often use the term psychological safety only because I think safety is very subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that as leaders, our job is to create a psychologically supportive environment. Safety isn't something that we can say that we're creating. It's something that the people under our stewardship say that they experience.
Right. Which is similar. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. It's similar to when we're talking about trauma. And one experience may be, you may experience, one person may experience something as traumatic, whereas another person may say, well, that's Tuesday. So
Got
there's
it.
some subjectivity to that as well. And for
Yeah.
us to maybe suspend judgment and be able to say, all right, maybe this experience that you're having, I would not consider that to be stressful, but I
Mhm.
recognize where you're at and I recognize that that is stressful for you and what it's creating for you. And I'm here for you. Yeah, I see that there's probably a little bit more. They're cousins, right? They're in the same family. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In the creating or holding of space as a trauma-informed leader, I am not thinking about, well, I wouldn't see this thing as traumatic, but I understand that you do, right? My experience actually in this particular situation where I'm holding space for someone else's experience, my experience doesn't actually matter because when we put those things on sort of a comparative plane,
Mm-hmm.
that's where we get into a little bit of a tricky territory. So internally, we're human. So
Yeah.
internally, the thought might be, wow, I can't believe that you think that's traumatic or that's a difficult experience, but we're not saying that,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Right, right. But there are some people in many work environments that do say that. That's sort of this command and control, sort of authoritative or autocratic leadership style, where it's kind of like the get over it, we have work to do. Luckily, sink or swim, right? So luckily, those are being phased out little by little by little, but we do still see them even today,
Yeah.
which blows my mind on one hand, and then the other hand, I'm like, well, of course, because no one wants to change to this degree. Change is hard. A lot of people rail against it, especially when the systems that they've been operating in have been benefiting them, right? So, yeah, maybe that's another podcast as well.
I was going to ask you, how can a leader hold space? And what are some things that they can say? So naturally, it's very natural to kind of compare. Obviously, you're not going to say that out loud, but what would you recommend a leader says if they're speaking to someone and the experience is someone is being very vulnerable with them?
So typically the language would be, and again, it has to be in your own voice and tone and what comes naturally to you. But typically it would be like, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Or I might say, thank you for trusting me with that, right? Because then I'm going one step further and naming that there's trust in the space that's been created where you feel like being vulnerable in that moment, I'm the person that you can do that with, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm honoring that trust. Things along those lines, you don't have to fix it for people, right? As the leader, your job is not to know everything there is to know about trauma and know how to fix people. Like literally, it's the opposite of that. It's just holding that space, leading with compassion, lighting the way for others when you can, and really just leaning in and thanking people for their presence and their vulnerability because people spend more time at work than any other place, even if they're working from home,
Yep.
right? And so they're choosing to be in relationship, however you want to define that, with your organization and with you as the leader, the manager, the director, the supervisor, whatever your title, they're choosing that. And if they're able to tell you what's actually true and what's going on inside of them, or a risk that, or a threat, or something that's happening that they're noticing, and they're able to bring that to your attention, that's a gift,
Yes, it
right?
is.
And they feel safe with you to do that. So thanking them for sharing that information and naming the trust feels like a good way forward there.
Yes, yes. And would you even go a step further to ask in your own words, what would you like for me to do with this information? Would you like help with this? Do you want someone to talk through this with you? Because some people want to jump straight to solutions, right?
Lots of leaders
Yes.
do, type A.
Yes, yes.
I think there are lots of layers or lots of options as to how you can do that, right? The best way that I know for me is yes, asking what the other person wants, and instead of assuming what we want to do for them, right? I think there's a lot of tricky territory that you can kind of get into when you make assumptions as to what someone is actually wanting after sharing something with you. That feels like empowering them as well. Another way that I might say that slightly differently would be, I trust you to come and let me know if there is something that I can do.
Yeah.
Because what that does is it takes the pressure off and it relieves that person of having, we've all been on the receiving end of getting some bad news or going through some bad experience. And someone's like, how can I help? That actually puts someone on the spot to now do the emotional labor or the mental gymnastics of trying to figure out how you can help them, right? So by saying, again, comes back to trust. I trust you to let me know if there's a way that I can support you.
Got it.
Right?
Yes, yes. Now, what has sort of helped you get to this place where you are now trauma informed and walking in this? Because going back to what you said earlier about some leaders in some organizations, sometimes it surprises you, sometimes it doesn't when they're still insensitive or still like, they should sink or swim. We don't need to care about people's feelings here. Yeah. I'm coming from a place of some people just don't know yet. They don't know how their behavior impacts others. They don't know the power of how they show up and how they can make or break someone's day. And so I'm coming from that standpoint, and I'm wondering what has helped you and others make that shift into from here I am right now, point A, to now I'm more trauma informed. I
Yeah.
recognize that this is a need.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, those leaders that you're talking about as examples, I would call them low conscious leaders. It doesn't mean that they're bad people. It means that they lack
Mm-hmm.
self-awareness, which probably means that they're not doing their healing work, right? They have a lot of trauma that has gone and continues to go unintegrated. So from like a Buddhist psychology standpoint, we would just think of them as wounded people or having wounded energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Something happened to them, they haven't resolved it. And so this is their projection of pain and the projection of their own suffering,
Yeah.
right? What has helped me is leaning into those studies of Buddhist psychology, compassion work, shadow work, really understanding what might be true on the other side,
Mm.
right? Because it's easy to say, oh, well, this person's just being a jerk,
Mm-hmm.
or this, there's a million
Yeah.
stories we can create about when people show up in those ways. But really starting to look at what might be true for them is really a practice in compassion. Then there also has to be a practice in self-compassion to say, well, what they said to me, I'm not gonna feed an internal narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I know that what they're actually saying and projecting on me is not true. So I can have compassion for them and I can also not absorb that and
Right.
digest that.
Right.
These are
Exactly.
only a few of the ways, right? There are lots and lots of practices that help you to see people for really what's happening. Most of these things are all rooted in fear, right? A lot of when we say wounded leaders, they're afraid, right? We become leaders because we either this deep sense of shame or powerlessness that we've experienced in childhood. And now we, especially these authoritative or authoritarian leaders that you're talking about, the sink or swim people, they felt deep shame and powerless when they were younger. And so subconsciously, sort of their ego is like, I never want to feel that way
Mm.
again. So I'm going to make sure that no one puts me in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so
Yeah.
that's really that projection of suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you about a scenario. I think it might help us if we this concept, take these concepts that we've been talking about and play with them a little bit with a realistic scenario. Sound good?
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, cool, cool, cool. Let me pull up this scenario. All right. I love it. So, we're talking about a leader named David. David is a manager, and David's behavior has been causing some friction with the team. During meetings, he often interrupts colleagues, saying things like, I've heard enough, let's move on, or we don't have time for this. And then when team members come to him with requests and suggestions, he tends to make snap decisions without fully hearing them out, leaving little room for discussion. His impatience and tendency to cut people off have been causing frustration among team members who feel unheard and undervalued. All right. I think this is a good scenario for us to dive
It is a
into.
great scenario.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
yes. Awesome. Okay, so when you think about this scenario with David, I've heard enough and makes quick decisions, knows what he's doing, knows where he wants to go, and is just moving faster than his team is. That's one way to look at it. Have you ever encountered a situation like this before?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I had I before I started my first company when I was 23, I was in corporate America for like a year and a half, oil
Mm-hmm.
and water situation. I left as quick as I could, but I did have a boss very much like David.
Mm. How did that impact you to work with a boss like David?
Well, at the time, I was pretty rebellious. So the way that I sort of worked with that is I just sort of circumnavigated it. It was like,
Mm.
I don't want to hear this, right? Like, I'm not going to engage with you. So I sort of circumnavigated it in the best ways that I could. I probably would not do it the same way. But again, I was like 21, 22
Mm-hmm.
when that situation occurred.
Yeah.
Now I would have a very different lens and I would have a much different way of dealing with it. Because really, what I'm talking about is when I say circumnavigate, that's sort of code for conflict avoidance. And so now I would really address that more head on.
Okay. Okay. You're right. So you were working around that David. So, knowing what you know now about trauma informed leadership, conscious leadership, all of that, how would you approach a situation like this or even guide someone through a situation like this?
Yeah, so I'm assuming in this scenario that some of the people that are under David's leadership are going to people who are maybe on the same level as David and complaining to them or sharing, what the experience has been. So that person should probably, because many things come from the top down, so that's the person who should be addressing this with David. If it's someone that David is leading, I imagine that nothing much is going to change because David is really leaning into those power dynamics,
Yes.
right? So if I were sort of David's equal or even supervisor, I may have a conversation to say, hey, there's some shared impact that I need to make you aware of. Many of the people on your team are feeling disempowered, are feeling unheard, unseen. And I recognize that your style is very much like it's all business, right? But that's not working for them. That's actually not working for you, even though you think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And there will be repercussions if there isn't some change that's made because it's actually impacting the organization, like the entire team that you're leading and the organization as a whole. So, what I'd like to know is, are you committed to becoming a better leader? If your answer is yes, we can move forward.
Mm-hmm.
I would be very direct. I would share other people's experiences without naming names and ask for commitment because at the end of the day, David has to want to change.
Yes.
If David doesn't want to change, we can show him the door,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
That's
We can
really what
unhire
it's about.
David.
We can unhire David. Yes. I also might slyly leave him a copy of Heal to Lead on his desk when
Yes.
he's at lunch.
Oh, that is awesome. I love what you said about there's some shared impact that I need to make you aware of. And asking him to commit, sharing how this is not working for them. Guess what? Believe it or not, it's also not working for you. Those little like snippets, that's gold. Oftentimes people are afraid to confront or to address a leader who is not operating from a conscious place. So, is there anything that you would recommend that could help someone move from conflict avoidance to, I'm ready. I'm ready to have this conversation. I know it's important. We're going to do this. We're going to lean in.
Yeah. So conflict avoidance is part of people-pleasing tendencies, right? We don't want to rock the boat.
Right.
What might happen, the story that we tell ourselves is that, this person might reject us, might abandon us. Obviously, these are more relational, but
Mm-hmm.
they are the same for the workplace.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to protect ourselves as best as possible. And the way that we do that as people pleasers who are conflict avoidant is to avoid the conflict, just like I did when I was 21 or 22. So I think if you are in therapy, talking specifically about this with your therapist is a great start. If your organization allows you to have coaching, that's a great place to lean into,
That one-on-one support.
that one-on-one support where you
Mm-hmm.
can talk through. I mean, I often have conversations with some of my clients. Hey, I've got to have this really hard conversation with this difficult employee. Can we like workshop this? Here's what I want to say, but I want to make sure I'm saying it in the right way and etc. Or this has been going on for far too long, and now I feel like I have to bring it up because my hand is being forced here. It's really becoming an issue in the company. So how do I do
Yes.
this? How do I navigate that? And so you can have conversations like that with a coach. There may be others people on your support team that you may be able to have the conversation with. I don't know if, depending upon your particular HR structure, if there would be someone inside of HR, like let's say you don't have a stipend for coaching, maybe someone inside of HR. Many like HR and people departments now actually have trauma-informed coaches. I have a couple of clients who have trauma-informed coaches inside of their people ops department.
Oh, very cool.
So it is becoming, I mean, maybe on much larger
Mm-hmm.
organizations, obviously, but yeah, there's got to be someone who can be a support to you, whether that's on the personal, meaning like a therapy relationship, or professionally inside of the organization.
Yes, yes. That is so good. And one thing that I would love to touch on, because this is the Lead with Levity podcast, I would like to talk a little bit about levity, if that's all
Okay,
right with you.
let's
We've
do
been
it.
focusing in on
This stuff
trauma.
can get it can get real heavy, so
It
like let's get
can. It
lighter.
can get really heavy. So, considering that life, work, all the things can get really heavy, what do you do or what do you recommend to help bring some levity, bring some fun, bring some joy back into your day?
So definitely I'm going to go with somatics here.
Oh,
So somatics can mean anything, right?
okay.
Somatics can mean getting one of those little tiny trampolines and putting it in your office if you have space for that, or putting it in your home and literally just jumping on a trampoline like you're a 4-year-old. It's so much fun. My partner has one in her house. It's
Yeah,
so much fun.
I have a
Just
trampoline.
doing that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so good, right? And you really embody, you start to think of yourself and feel like you're, 4 years old again. Dancing. Even if you're not a person who is like the first one on the dance floor, or maybe
Hmm.
even the 50th person on the dance floor, dancing in the privacy of your own home. Put your favorite song on and just be in socks and or
Yeah.
barefoot, just moving your body in a way that feels really good to you. If you want to sing the song at the same time, again, getting that all this heaviness and all of that out of your body. One of the things that I'm really into right now, which some people may not think of as fun, but I actually get a lot of joy out of it, is
Yes.
walking barefoot in my yard and my
Huh.
gardens and around the house. I have never done that before. I don't know if why that is. I have like little soft baby feet, and I've always been like, no, I don't, they're so soft that everything hurts. But the
Yeah.
more that I'm actually connecting to nature, feels really grounding. And it's
Mm,
also really fun
mm.
because I get to feel the little tickle of the grass on my feet, or I can get closer to a flower or a tree that's in one of the beds that I
Yes.
couldn't, get close to. So those things feel fun to me, and they feel lighter at the same time that they're also grounding.
Mm.
So those are
Yes.
like three of the things that I can think of off the top of my head.
And it's something that you shouldn't wait until the end of the week to do. You should find opportunities to do these things every day, every single day. Yes.
I am doing this podcast barefoot.
Really?
Yeah. I can prove it to you if you want, but I don't think you want to see my feet.
You
But
can
yeah,
keep your feet
yeah.
down on the floor. It's all good. Kelly.
Also grounding though, right? Like it feels
Yes.
fun, I feel connected, and it's like you see me from the chest up here, and but I've got no socks or shoes on. I actually do that for a lot of my coaching calls as well.
Mm.
And sometimes we'll ask, especially if a client is feeling a little bit more frenetic or has a lot of stress, anxiety, things going on, I will ask them to take their shoes and socks off and
Ah.
just like really have their feet down on the ground and really call attention to all of the that energy that is always present in the bottoms of our feet, but we
We
are
just kind
so
of bind it up.
distracted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we do. Well, this has been such a great conversation. Kelly, what's on the horizon for you?
I am getting to do a ton of speaking engagements, which feels really fun. And, at different organizations,
Yes.
as well as like keynotes at conferences all around the book. And the other thing that I've been doing, just started doing it along the lines of barefoot, I'm doing book readings
Mm-hmm.
in plant stores, like
Oh,
plant shops,
huh.
which is really fun. I was thinking about what are the venues that would bring me the most joy. And if you think about, no one can really walk into a plant shop and feel unhappy. You're met with so much oxygen and,
Yes.
it's so lush and so beautiful. And so that environment feels really good to me. And
Mm,
so, yeah, that's what I'm up to.
very cool. Very cool. If anyone is interested in learning more about you and everything that you offer, where should they go?
Just my website, klcampbell.com.
Perfect. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence today. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks for tuning in to the Lead with Levity podcast. To get resources mentioned in this episode and find out what we're all about, check us out at leadwithlevity.com.